Okay, team, I think we'll get started. Again, thanks for everyone for coming. My name is Brian Chaffin. I'm a board member at the Redside Foundation. The Redside Foundation is a nonprofit organization supporting the health and strength of Idaho's guiding community. And we also support guides, outfitting, and the career choices that come with guiding all across the country and the world. And so we're happy to have you join us from wherever you are tonight. Thanks so much. What are we doing? Why are we doing it? Well, this is welcome to guiding and outfitting with COVID 2020. Kind of a recap of the summer season and the spring season and entering into the fall season. We put on a webinar as the Redside Foundation in the spring, as we were all kind of uncertain of what coming into guiding in a pandemic might look like. And we provided some information and some discussion, and we thought it'd be a great idea to have a little bit of follow-up. And see how things went for people so far and what our thoughts and fears are and hopes and dreams are coming into the fall and winter guiding season. And so we put together a great group of panelists tonight to discuss some of these issues and answer any questions, talk about any experiences you might have had. So thanks very much for joining us. We have three great panelists tonight. We have Dr. Jessica Evans-Wall. She's a resident emergency room physician at the University of New Mexico Hospital. We have Merrick Robinson. Merrick is the CEO of ARTA River Trips, and he's going to talk to us a little bit from an operational perspective. And we have Bree Minkler, and Bree is a licensed professional counselor, and she works in the Boise healthcare system and is also the Redside Foundation's case manager. Before we go any further, I want to introduce really quick the executive director of the Redside Foundation to tell you a little bit about us, as well as give us a couple plugs before we get started. Shannon, take it away.
Hey everybody, thanks so much for coming. I'm Shannon, ED for Redside. If you are a guide or know a guide who's having any issues that needs help, like mental health issues or substance abuse issues, you can call our guide helpline. Bree will be the person who calls you back, and we'll make sure that you or that person gets the help they need. We just finished a period of getting scholarship applications. 3 people got scholarships. That announcement will be coming soon. That opportunity is open to any guide in the fall. So next September, you can apply for that. And professional development grants are also just recently given out. We are having a photo contest right now. We're accepting entries until November 15th. There are some excellent prizes, including a Big Agnes sleeping bag, some Chromapop Smith sunglasses, some Cricut knives. So send photos to info@redsidefoundation.org, and we'll get you some prizes if you win. Thanks so much for coming. This is going to be great. Thanks, panelists, for being here. We really appreciate you all.
Thanks, Shannon. Really appreciate it. So here's what we're going to do tonight. We're going to give each of the panelists about 5 to 10 minutes to talk about the theme from their perspective. They've each prepared some comments to bring to us. And then we are going to open it up to a moderated discussion. And the discussion will go much better, smoother, more interesting if we get some feedback from you. So in the bottom of your screen, in the Zoom screen, if you pulled this up on either your phone or the computer, there's a button called Q&A. There's a chat and there's Q&A. We aren't going to check the chat as much. We're going to check the Q&A section. So put questions in there, and we'll do one of two things. We'll either answer it right there, and if we answer it, everybody can see our answer. But most of what we'll do is probably take those questions and answer them live on the webinar, and we'll talk about them as a group. And so if you put a question in there, it'll be anonymous when you put it in. But then if we answer it on the webinar, then you'll see that pull up in the Q&A section. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first panelist and get started. Dr. Jessica Evans-Wall. Like I said, she's a resident physician at the University of New Mexico Hospital. Jess moved all over growing up, but she started her river experiences, and it's kind of a theme amongst the panelists. All of the panelists really started their formative guiding, what really cemented the idea of guiding their head very early in life. And so Jess started on the Snake and Clearwater area in the Lewiston area. Before she decided she wanted to go to college and then on to medical school, she went abroad and worked for conservation nonprofits in Russia, Zimbabwe, Mexico, and the UK. She got an undergrad at Duke and eventually went to medical school at Tufts University in Boston, but not before guiding and managing a little bit of the operation there for Roe in Idaho on the Lochsaw and the Middle Fork River. So she's a guide, she's an emergency room doc, she's dealing with COVID all the time. She's got a great perspective with us. And she also teaches wilderness medicine for Desert Mountain Medicine. So she's got a great wealth of experience, and I look forward to her comments. Go ahead, Jess.
Thanks, Brian. I also love getting to see all the names of people participating. I miss the river community being kind of state bound and limited travel right now. So as Brian was saying, right now I am working as an emergency physician here. I'm still in my residency, which means that I do a lot of rotations in intensive care units as well. And so it's been interesting from the medical perspective, seeing people come in through the ED and then getting to follow up with them in the intensive care unit, people who are coming in for COVID. So I feel like it's given me a little bit of a skewed perspective of how sick people are, because I see the really sick people. So I'm trying to give you a little bit broader of a perspective to kind of focus on things that are a little bit more relevant for guiding. So when this all started, like, what were the things that we were worried about? I feel like the things that we were worried about was like, who gets it, who gets really sick, and how does it spread? And how it's spread, I feel like there was a lot of kind of back and forth early because we weren't sure. You know, is it just droplet? Can you only get it if you touch your face? Or is there also this aerosolized? So if like somebody coughs and you like walk into the room after they cough, can you get it that way? And early on, even in the hospital, we had some mixed messaging of, you know, do we need to wear N95 masks that really filter out everything, or can we just wear a cloth or surgical mask, and is that okay? So for a while, more based on the fact that we didn't have any N95s available, we just wore surgical masks. Now, as we've learned more, we do think that it is spread by aerosol. So if somebody coughs in a room, especially if they don't have a mask on and you're in a tight space, then that is concerning. Like that's a vector. It's not just the touching surfaces and then touching your face. It's also if somebody is coughing a lot and you are near them to breathe in that aerosolized aspect. So it is both. So now we sort of at least know that answer and we can adjust our behaviors accordingly. The other thing is like, who gets really sick with it? And I think the good news for this, for the guiding community, is generally the people who we see getting really sick statistically aren't the same demographics as our guides, but they are kind of the same demographics as a lot of our guests on trips, especially river trips. And so I think that's something to be considering when we're thinking about our safety on the trips. The things that we know put people at highest risk are high blood pressure, obesity, and diabetes, and then any prior lung disease. So if somebody has like significant scarring in their lungs, that would also put them at risk. But I feel like those are the things, and we see people right on river trips who like have high blood pressure, are obese, and also have diabetes. And so that's one of those things that I think when we're thinking about the population to get really sick. So we've a little bit chatted about kind of now, like those are the things we know now. What are the things moving forward? And I'm hoping that this is actually like the more interesting aspect of at least what I'm saying, is like, what are the behaviors that we can choose to make moving forward in the outdoor community? So one of the things to think about is, if we don't get a vaccine, everyone's sort of anchoring on this like vaccine. Are we going to get a vaccine? I am very optimistic that we will. It might not be super effective right away. They're focusing definitely more on safety, which is fantastic for the development of it. And so we don't know how effective it'll be. If we weren't to get a vaccine, the estimation is that 60 to 70% of the population would get corona. And the reason is because although the mortality rate is not that high, which is great, the infection rate is really high. So it's a very infectious virus. It's not very virulent, but it's very infectious. And so that's something to be thinking about moving forward, is that even though we are seeing more people get it and our overall mortality is going down, it still is very, very infectious. things that we can also be thinking about and kind of looking forward to, besides hopefully this vaccine, which some estimations say is about January, is thinking about treatments for the virus. Right now, we don't have any medications that specifically target the virus. We have steroids that we give. I know that this is a big conversation right now, is like dexamethasone is, we used to think about it with just altitude, and now it's like the COVID medication. It's just an anti-inflammatory. It's not targeting the virus, but they are coming up with medications called monoclonal antibodies, which are pooled from people's plasma who have already had the virus and have antibodies against it. And they're working on using that as a medication to give people as a prophylaxis. So say you were on a trip and somebody ended up becoming COVID positive and everyone was exposed on that trip. In the next, hopefully, few months, there's the possibility that those people that were exposed could get treated with these monoclonal antibodies in order to have a treatment that specifically targets the virus. So I think that's exciting. There's some exciting things moving forward. The biggest things that I can say to do are get your flu shot, and continue to wash your hands, wear your mask, and keep your space. We can talk more specifically about winter guiding later if you want to, Brian, but like those closed-in spaces are going to be something to be thinking about because we know that it spreads via aerosolization. So the other, just one last thing, I feel like I'm taking up too much time, but is that whole like, if you've already had COVID, can you get COVID again piece? Which I think is also really interesting. Yes, there have been reinfections. It is rare. Most people are mostly immune after they have an infection that they had any kind of symptoms, so enough to mount an immune response. But the anticipation, at least right now, is that they're thinking that immunity will last a year. It will not be like a measles where it lasts for your life. It will be more like a flu where it lasts for that season or for that year. So then that next year, you could be reinfected again.
Great. Thanks, Jess. I really appreciate it. That's a good 10,000 foot view of kind of where we are, where we came from. I'm going to move on to Merrick Robinson. Merrick, I mentioned, is the CEO of Art of River Trips. Merrick's journey started when he was 11. He started vacationing in places where whitewater existed. And a day trip, I think, down the Snake River around Jackson really opened his eyes to a world that would be pretty significant for his life. He whitewater rafted and instructed guiding on some of the most challenging commercial whitewater run in the Americas. He spent several years doing the split season thing, following the sun, doing South America and North American guiding. And he worked for Echo from 1989 until 1994. He also was leading the company's operations in California and Oregon during some of that time. Merrick stepped away from guiding full-time in 1995 and had a really impressive career in sales, managing some really high talented sales teams that have revenue dollars that I'll never see in my lifetime. So he crushed the guiding world, and then he went out and used those transferable guiding skills to enter and succeed in the world of sales. Interestingly enough about Merrick speaks 3 languages, and he's traveled to all 50 states and 50 countries. And he joined ARDA after kind of hanging up the sales boots, if you will, in 2019. So he's a rather new CEO of ARDA, and he's here to talk about guiding in 2020 from more of an operational perspective of a large rafting company operating across multiple states and multiple land management agencies and multiple rivers. So Merrick, take it away.
Thanks, Brian. So I came back to the river community really just the end of last year, and then kind of rolling into 2020 proved to be exciting as an interesting way of explaining the season. We typically have a spring meeting where we sit down and kind of review what we think the year is going to look like. And going into that spring meeting in March this year, we were thinking that 2020 was going to be a pretty great river season. You know, our bookings looked really solid, and everything was really shaping up like, man, this is going to be a really fun season. About a week later, COVID hit, and we kind of decided to have a virtual board meeting just to be safe. We didn't really know what was going to happen. We thought, oh, this will probably blow over, but let's be cautious in the meantime and figure it out. Fast forward about 30 days into April, we went from thinking we were going to have this really great season to the reality that we may not have a season at all. And, you know, we went from thinking that we were going to employ a bunch of people to then not being able to employ anybody, wondering about, you know, the future of the industry, wondering about the future of the company, all of these things. And as we're watching cases globally skyrocket and the mortality rate increase, I mean, this fear factor really kind of set in, I think, for all of us, trying to figure out, like, are we even going to be able to run a season? And if we do, like, is it even a good idea? Is it going to be low risk enough to where we feel safe? Are we going to be able to put protocols in place to make sure that our guests are safe, that our guides are safe, that the communities that we work in are safe? And so it was a pretty tough time as we were kind of going through this, trying to just, you know, figure it all out. And what we ended up doing was, you know, working a lot with a lot of the different outfitter organizations state by state, and sort of, you know, putting together these consortiums of outfitters to try and figure out, like, what are we all going to do, kind of coming up with some standardized, accepted practices that we all felt we could kind of live with. We actually engaged some legal people to kind of help us design some of these risk management plans, and relied on experiences of outfitters across the country. There were all of these different operating plans being shared through all these different outfitter associations, and then working together, you know, with our management team to really kind of tailor it to a way that, you know, made sense for ARDA. And as we started going through this, we kind of hit this point of, okay, there's this acceptance of, you know, we have this obligation to try and run a river season, to try and support the local communities that we work in, to try and put our guides to work, you know, and to try and as crazy as it sounds, you know, our guests, if you really think about it, I mean, this is, for a lot of them, this is their one big vacation. And is there a way for us to continue to offer them that one big vacation? And so we kind of shifted our focus away from fear more into acceptance. Like, is there really a way to do this? And started, you know, kind of getting really tight on those plans. And what is it that we think we can do? What is it that we want to do? Developing a series of protocols internally, you know, how we would manage some of this stuff. And then also a lot of the communications with our guests, and trying to figure out what's the right group of guests to bring on the river? What are the right size trips to run? What are the right logistics to operate under? And kind of putting all of these plans into place. And so, you know, we use that window of time to update a lot of our liability agreements, to update our, what we call our code of conduct with our guests, to ensure that we were setting expectations for guests on how we think river trips will look like, you know, what they'll look like, and how people should act on river trips. And are we going to wear masks or not wear masks, and temperature checking, and all of these types of things. And a lot of what we did initially was really kind of try and discourage a lot of those people that Jess described, those at-risk people, from coming out and getting on river trips this year. And so we spent a lot of effort in advance of the trips, reaching out to all of the people that had booked trips, trying to make it really easy for them to, you know, opt out of the 2020 season, essentially, you know, opt out of 2020 and look at 2021, or look at later in the season, or, you know, come up with these different ideas to try and really reduce that risk as much as possible. We knew there was no way to eliminate the risk 100%, but as we started looking at the different protocols, and as we started to understand all of the guidelines that were coming out during that time, we kept hearing that the probability of transmission outdoors was pretty low. So that made us feel a little bit better. We kept hearing that the probability of transmission, you know, from a solid object to your hand or something like that, and then to your face and to your mouth, that was getting lower and lower. We started hearing that the probability of, you know, transmission via food was a pretty low probability as well. And so we started to look at, you know, what are all the different things that we do on a river trip, and a lot of the things that we do ended up in that lower risk category. Transportation was still kind of that higher risk thing that we were trying to do, and we made a lot of changes in our execution as far as how we ran shuttles, how we did all of that. I mean, all of a sudden, as we looked at trips, the idea of putting 15 people into a 15-passenger van just did not seem very exciting for our guides, our guests, our drivers. I mean, all of that stuff started to change, and we looked at different ways of doing that. Some of the rivers where we're able to, we hiked people to put in. Others, we used large school buses for small groups of people, and really kind of got creative with that. And then, obviously adopted a lot of mask wearing on those shuttles, and even in some areas of our camp operations and things like that. And so, essentially we set out from this point of fear to acceptance to, putting these plans together. And then really what we relied heavily on, and I've said this a bunch of times and I'll continue to say it. I mean, I can't thank our guides enough for the work that they did on the execution side, because ultimately we can develop all of these great plans, but our guides really did a phenomenal job throughout the season in continuing to do that same thing over and over, on the trips, at the guide houses, in town, all of those things. And it allowed us to, go through a season, employ a crew of guides, for the season. We put a lot of guests down the river. We're able to deliver expectations for them for, great vacations and having a lot of fun. And, ultimately, it ended up being a good season, but it took us doing a lot of things differently. We moved our guides around a lot less. As Brian mentioned, we have operations in multiple states. Normally it's pretty routine for us to move people from one area to another. This year, we pretty much reduced that to almost zero, not all of it, but we really deliberately tried not to move people from areas. We tried to put our guides more into pods, and guides, stayed in those pods for most of the season. But sitting here now at the end of the season, it ended up, a lot of the protocols that we put in place and a lot of the execution of our guides ended up being very successful from a safety standpoint. And we really had no real incidences throughout the whole season. So it worked out as well as we could have hoped.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Merrick. I appreciate that. So we've really gone from kind of an overview of what we did and didn't know about COVID and how that changed throughout the season, how that Merrick brought us into kind of what that looks like from an operational perspective. And I really want to scale down now to kind of the individual. What were the challenges that individual guides faced in their pursuing their livelihood and their jobs, their professions, and also what the future holds for that. So I'd like to introduce, to talk about that, Bree Minkler. And Bree is the Redside Foundation case manager. So she manages our confidential mental health helpline that anyone, any guide and currently in Idaho, but hopefully in the future, maybe beyond that, can call confidentially to access financial support and logistical support for finding mental health care for guides in need. And it's been a cornerstone of Redside's work and our mission for a long time. And so Bree's been with us since the beginning, and we really appreciate Bree, and I want to just kind of give a shout out to her because of her hard work on that helpline. Bree was born and raised in northern Idaho, and she went on her first whitewater rafting trip at age 7. And so, like I said, started early. She started guiding on the Salmon in 2000, and she met her husband there at one of the first guide parties, and the rest is history. They now have a son, Fisher, who just turned 4 on the lower Salmon this summer. So the Salmon River runs through Bree's family. She went on to get a bachelor's degree at Boise State and a master's degree in clinical counseling from Northwest Nazarene. In addition to being a counselor and Redside's case manager, she also is the clinical supervisor and a counselor at St. Luke's in Boise. So without further ado, Bree, take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. So the helpline, it's confidential, so I'm certainly not going to talk about what people actually are calling in for, but just globally, people are certainly calling in about the stress of COVID and how to navigate their jobs and their relationships, and what it looks like to be an employee during this time. And then there was still the vast majority of our calls were guides living their regular lives, experiencing regular life things, and just needing some support with that. So I think it's like an important call out that even though we're living in COVID, our lives are still happening. People are still experiencing the struggles that they always have, the struggles and the successes. So our guides are just still dealing with the day-to-day on a general basis. In terms of managing stress, our guides, just us generally, I think we're experiencing a lot of stress. We're experiencing it in very different ways. Feel like there's kind of this range of like very low grade anxiety where it's just constant, it's present. You kind of wake up with it, you go to bed with it. So there's just like low grade anxiety that's just present. There's the anxiety it's like an ocean wave where it comes in and it kind of like surrounds you, and then it kind of fades off again, and maybe you're feeling functional and you're doing well, and then it kind of happens again. People are reporting an increase in panic attacks, or just the feeling of panic attacks and that can look like, if you're not totally sure what that is, it's like some people feel like they're having heart attacks. They go to EDs often feeling like they're having heart attacks. It's just like that really intense pressure in your chest, and some weight, often like sweaty, face sweating, hands sweaty, having really hard time concentrating, things like that. And then there's some people that it's really kind of exacerbated some pre-existing trauma that they've experienced. And when we think of trauma, we often think of like really big trauma, like one big event that has happened, but really trauma can be exacerbated by little things that just chip away at you and your self-confidence and self-worth and your understanding of your life in this world and who you are. So we're really noticing an increase in trauma and kind of the acute stress related to that. So there's this gamut of anxiety and a gamut of stress that people are experiencing that is incredibly normal. We would expect that based on what's happening. Because our bodies are essentially designed to be a feedback loop, which is basically like they're essentially your thermostat in your home, where it regulates the temperature of your home, and our bodies are constantly regulating, and they're trying to upregulate and downregulate. So we have this state of balance. So really for the last 7 months, our bodies have been just in this state of dysregulation, and they're constantly trying to keep up. So no wonder we're exhausted, no wonder we're irritable and have poor concentration and feeling maybe a little sad and sluggish, or experiencing more anxiety than we've ever experienced before. So I think really normalizing it and letting everyone know that this is a normal response to a really abnormal situation, and to be really patient with yourself. And some of the kind of working through that is a lot of really good self-care. And self-care is a pretty buzzy word right now. And it can be anything, really self-care is just anything that makes you feel better, that makes you feel like you are going to be a success, that you can manage the next day, that you can take the next step. I was at a training today at work, and one of our ED doctors was talking about moral distress and managing that in the ED world. Jess is like, yes. It's also very buzzy, but she was like, yoga and meditation are not going to save the world's problems, but they will make you feel better. And the making you feel better is the thing that's going to allow you to make the better choice, to do the thing differently, to have a more solution focused and forward future, and thinking for more forward future. So really just encouraging that self-care, encouraging the connection with other people in whatever way that works for you, in a safe, of course, we're advocating for safety right now. And so really trying to manage that in a way that's doable for everyone. Again, this is, like Jess said, this isn't going away overnight. So really just trying to plan for yourself. Like, what do the holidays look like? What does this winter look like? What does the transition to the new season look like for you? And how can you be your best self throughout that? And again, if you're struggling with that, feel free to call me. I will answer the helpline phone. You'll leave a message, I will answer it. We will get you connected with some counseling. Along with the counseling through the Redside, if you have commercial insurance, that often will pay for counseling. If you are an employee of a school district, of any job, really, they're often partnered with an employee assistance program, which is essentially, again, free counseling. If you are a student, every university in the nation has a counseling center. Again, free counseling. And so we can problem solve. How do you afford it? How do you use the counseling at school or with your job? And how does Redside help offset some of the costs of that? So we can problem solve, and we can get really creative to help you access the services that you need to be the best you can right now. So yeah.
Awesome. Thanks, Bree. I really appreciate it. And just to clarify too, folks can text our helpline as well, can they not?
Yes, text.
Great.
Yeah, do that.
Great. Jess, I'm actually gonna, before we move on, Bree kind of had a great segue into something that I think we talked about earlier, things that guides can do both during this transition or as they ramp up into their winter season, whatever that might be. And you had some suggestions from kind of the medical side of things, and I thought maybe this would be a good time to highlight that.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, I think one of my biggest suggestions right now is to get your flu shot. I feel like this is one of those platforms I don't want to be like all these public safety announcements, but I think that that's a really huge one. This year, it's a 4-valent vaccine. They're really trying to cover more broadly, and that's super helpful to protect you and to protect anyone that you're around. The concern is that the combination, if you could have a co-infection, which we know can happen, a co-infection of flu and COVID, that it would obviously like exponentially make both of those illnesses worse. So getting a flu shot is a great thing to do to prep yourself for this next season. You can look up resources. I was just actually looking it up for New Mexico of different places to get free or inexpensive flu shots if you don't have health insurance right now. Walgreens is one of them. CVS has a minute clinic that you can go in. You have to go for specific hours, but they'll have them for as little as $5 for a flu shot. The Department of Health, wherever you are, you can always look them up as well. And they oftentimes have free flu shot clinics. So that's something that, like, there are great resources. It's not an expensive thing. They're available for free. I'm happy to try to put in either the chat or the Q&A, some websites that are good resources to check for your local area of where to find that flu shot. And then other things is just continuing the things that you're doing. I know we're all tired of it, but like masks really do help. So they help other people. But we also have more and more literature that's showing that they help you. So you're not just like doing a good job for public health and when you're wearing your mask, you're also protecting yourself because viral load matters. So if you get just a couple of viral particles, you may not actually get COVID, or you may have a very, very mild case, versus if you get a whole lot of exposure, a lot of viral particles, then you're gonna have a more severe illness. And they've actually been able to map that better and better throughout the course. And so wearing that mask is like super helpful for you, that even if you're exposed, you'll have a more mild illness. Obviously hand washing, and then space is the other thing. And we can talk about this more later, because I know there've been a couple questions for winter guiding, and I think there are so many unknowns for that, but that like space really does make a difference. So that 6 feet makes a difference if you're in enclosed spaces or just being outside. And the winter is hard for that, right? Like unless you're outside doing wonderful winter activities, it is harder to spend time outside. So I think that like mask wearing inside and maintaining space inside is going to be important for the winter time.
Mm-hmm. Jess, I want to stick on that specific point for just a second. There's a question in the Q&A. Says follow up on guiding and ski huts, and you may not know the answer to this, but if you do, I'd just give an opportunity. Are air filters a worthy investment to protect guides and clients?
That's a really great question. I think it's an interesting one. I only know a little bit about this. There haven't been a ton of studies that I've seen, but there are filters that are specifically designed to be able to filter out viral particles. It is hard to find the like virus specific ones because it has to be so small. But that's a possibility, is to like look for those type of filters that are specific to viruses. The other thing that seems really easy to me that also just decreases the overall viral load in the air is like humidifiers or infusers. And so that's something else that we've talked about even just in the hospital, like putting around all of our workstations, which sounds kind of lovely, but like to decrease the viral load in the air. And so that's another possibility that might be inexpensive and easy. Again, not tons of literature with that, but like the overall idea is that those little humidified particles of water would end up like binding with the viruses in the air and then making them sink. And so then you're not gonna breathe them in.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thanks, Jess. And thanks again to all our panelists. This is a great kind of round robin, and now we'll go into a little bit more focused discussion, but I really appreciate all the 3 perspectives that were brought here. What I want to do for a second is take a quick break. Don't go anywhere, but I'm going to launch a poll. And so give just a second here, and I'm hoping that you can all see on your screen now a poll that we created for you each to take. And so there's 2 questions on there. And obviously these questions don't cover the gamut of what we, or what type of answers you probably could give, but we wanted to give some feedback to all of you on the webinar to see kind of where everybody else falls in this area. So go ahead and take that poll. I'm gonna leave it open for 60 seconds. Fill in your answers, and then I'll close polling and show you the results. I see folks are starting to answer. That's good. Got some active participants. All right, doing well. About 15 more seconds on that poll. Excellent. Looks like most of our polling results are in. Let's go ahead and close the poll. And I'm going to share results with you. So you should all be seeing the results. Panelists, let me know. Are you seeing the results? Yes? Yes, okay, you're seeing the results. Good. So it looks like in the first question, if you guided this spring, summer, fall, how different was guiding during COVID-19? And not surprisingly, no one chose not different at all. And it looks like very different was our strongest, and extremely different and slightly different right there. So it was different, and we all kind of recognize that. It's not a mind-blowing kind of result there. But down here, if we scroll down, this is kind of interesting. We've heard a lot about this, that guest guide interactions were some of the most challenging things that guides faced this summer, because they were very different. But it looks like also folks were worried about not knowing whether or not COVID transmission was happening. So that's a great result. Thanks very much for participating in that. What I'd like to do is I'm going to go to some targeted questions to our panelists, but at the same time, when I ask a question, so for example, my first question is going to be, what were some of the unexpected challenges and the biggest differences of outfitting and guiding in 2020? And if you have some things that aren't being discussed that you'd like to share, go ahead and pop those in the Q&A, in the question. And I don't need to write us a novel about it, but give us some topics to also to talk about or to mention on the webinar. And so for this question, what were the biggest challenges or unexpected things that kind of came up? I think I'll start with Merrick, and then if other folks want to chime in, we will do that. So go for it.
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, aside from the fact that, we at times didn't know if we were going to have a season, didn't know if the government was going to allow us to operate in certain areas. It was kind of a river by river approach. I mean, some of the things that we ran into early on was, one, just, whether or not we were even going to have enough guides to be able to run a season. Most of our guiding training goes on during the spring, and we weren't able to actually run any new guide training, any existing guide training. And so it was a challenge for us just to be able to have enough guides to be able to work. So that was a factor. And then the other part of that is that the guides that we did have, being able to provide adequate training for them, even preseason, during the season was more challenging than we would have hoped or expected. Another thing that was, definitely a challenge for us was that in a lot of the areas where we operate, we rely heavily on, local communities to provide transportation, shuttle driving, those types of things. And with COVID, what we found was that a lot of the people that normally provide those services were possibly in that at-risk category, or those services weren't running this season. And so we had to really adapt a lot of our back, sort of behind the scenes logistics on how to actually run trips, because of some of the normal logistical things that would happen normally during the course of a year. So those were a couple of big things. And then, also just sort of the whole last minute piece of, cancellations and trip changes with people getting COVID. So, we made it really clear to our guests in advance that if you're symptomatic, before a trip, or if you've been exposed, obviously please don't come on a trip. And so we had a number of people, 3 days before a trip, like, hey, my son was exposed or my daughter was exposed or something, and we're canceling, and we're trying to find friends to go in our place. And so there was a lot of scrambling, on the logistics side there.
Excellent, thanks. Related to especially your opportunities or the challenges for opportunities for training, there's a great question that was posed. Will there be opportunities, you think, for new guides and new river guides in 2021? What's the impact that COVID's having on bookings in the future, guides currently wanting work, and the ability to start and make this a bigger part of your career?
So I'd say we're hiring.
Yeah, there you go.
We're having the conversation this week and looking at, getting all of our, we call them pro guide schools. And so the schools that we run to essentially hire guides from, we normally run 2 a year. We're looking at possibly doing 3 next year, just to be able to accommodate what we feel is a gap in guides. And interesting from a 2021 season perspective, because we moved so many guests from 2020 to 2021, our 2021 season or preseason bookings are exponentially higher than they normally would be at this time of year. But at the flip side too, there's not a lot of people right now that are thinking about their summer vacation for 2021. So it might be a false positive at this point, like, how big that season's going to be. But either way, we feel like, one, because we just didn't get to do any training last year, that we're going to need to kind of double down on that for new guides. And then we also have a lot of training planned for our existing guide crew to continue to develop skills there too.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's a great point. And we've heard that kind of across the board, that seasons are going, a lot of outfitters push bookings to 2021, and seasons are going to be big. Outfitters are going to need guides. And so I would encourage people that are thinking along that line to contact companies that have guide schools on opportunities on their websites, and find out when those dates are, and kind of go after that in that direction. Yeah, great. Let's. Does anyone else want to weigh in? Jess or Bree or even Shannon want to weigh in on unexpected challenges in 2020? That's okay. Don't have to. That's great. Thanks.
I think, sorry, just one thing real quick, Brian. I think this came up more in my conversations with Nadia Kimmel for DMM stuff, but it was all that like guiding related for running those wilderness courses, and making sure that people are still getting certified and trained to be able to do first aid in the setting of COVID. And I think that that's one of those challenges that will continue as we continue to learn more. I think those protocols will all be getting updated, and we'll have to be coming up with plans of what does it look like if you have to do a resuscitation in the wilderness? What are the PPE guidelines going to be for if you have somebody who you are having to do rescue breathing for? I think all that stuff, we kind of came up with a plan, at least with DMM early in the season, but I think that's all going to be evolving. So I think that's going to be one of those other challenges, is a lot of those protocols are going to have to be shifting around as we learn more to just try to keep guides as safe as possible.
Great, thanks. Let's transition to Let's transition to the guide, to the individual. And another question that's been coming up a lot in our discussions with Redside are, you have a colleague, you have a coworker that is having this, as Bree put it, the wave crash over them in and out, and is having trouble maintaining a level of functionality at work. And we're not saying it's they shouldn't be on the job or shouldn't be doing the job, but they might just have a really bad day that's not normal for this person, or they might be having a panic attack that they've never had before. What are some strategies to kind of help walk this coworker through that and create an atmosphere where they can feel safe and supported and healthy in their job? And I'll start with Bree there.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. So my approach to crisis management is always, we're just getting the person back to their baseline level of functioning. And it may not quite reach that, but that's the goal. We're not trying to improve their mental health. We're not trying to resolve something long-term trauma. We're just trying to get them to the point where they're now functioning, where they can be a productive coworker, where they can make safe, healthy choices, where they're not an emotional like they're not crying kind of uncontrollably, or they're able to take a breath and be a leader in a way that they need to be a leader on the river. And they can certainly take a break from guiding. They can certainly resolve all those things when they get off the water, but either for that day or for the remainder of that trip, needing to help them manage those big feelings. And a lot of that is just going to be like, I hear you. I know this is happening right now. You are okay. You are safe. You're here. A lot of grounding, like feel the ground, you know, put your hands on the ground, touch this tree, touch me. Do you see the color red anywhere, or green or brown, or just a lot of very in the moment grounding exercises are really the best ways to get people from this like state of disassociation of like they're kind of out above and beyond themselves to a very here and now moment where they can start thinking with like the front of their brain versus like the primitive part of their brain. We don't want their caveman brain taking over. We need full functioning here up in their frontal lobe. So yeah.
It's hard for me not to make a comment about how my caveman brain is constantly taking over.
Yes.
But great. Thanks so much, Bree. Jess, Merrick, or Shannon, anyone else want to add to that?
No, I think that was amazing, Bree. I think that letting people know that they are a priority in the setting, and trying to find those like constants or controllables, since there's like so many things that are uncontrollable. So like, what is the one thing you can control? And like kind of focusing on that, you know, like maybe it is like, hey, I'm going to do like this one dish for dinner and I'm not going to focus on anything else. And I'm going to focus on that. And that's going to be the thing that I control tonight is like, I'm going to bake the best pineapple upside down cake ever. And like, that's it. Like the rest of the world can burn. And like, this is my focus. And so I think that like having those controllables is helpful. And then I think that just like that, like making sure that people know that they're a priority. In the hospital setting, I think sometimes it is similar to the guiding setting. It's a very dynamic environment. And so one of the sayings that we say in the emergency department, ironically, is that there is no emergency in a pandemic, meaning that you always have to take care of yourself and your team first. And so like you can't serve your guests on a trip until you have your team safe and like you are safe to be able to then go reach out and serve them. So I think that like just making sure that people know that they're a priority is really helpful too.
Awesome.
I would just add in there, you know, sort of fostering a culture of support, you know, with the crew, you know, making sure that the crew feels that they're supporting each other and supported by each other, you know, and making sure that there's, you know, some level of check-in on that. And so if a guide's having a hard day or a hard afternoon, that they can step away without judgment, without anything like that. And you know, everybody feeling good about that.
Thanks, Merrick. Thanks everyone for the answers to that question. That's an important one, an important piece. I also want to move to a question. We opened up this webinar to questions ahead of time to give us a little bit of time to prepare. And a question that we received, I think, is a good one, and it kind of stems from some of the things that we've seen. And if you remember the poll, one of the questions on the poll was how were interactions between guides, between companies, between other companies. And generally, our level of collegiality as outdoor guides at the trailhead with our other companies, at the put-in, on the trail, on the river, are always good, right? We love to see our other colleagues. And about 50% of you responded that those were strained this year, and we've heard a bit about that. And so one of the reasons that happened was that everybody's protocols were a little bit different, and there was a gamut of how people were reacting to COVID. There was a high stress, higher stress than normal. There were challenges with the land management agencies because they were operating sometimes vacant, sometimes in a little bit of a different mode. So our question to the panelists is, when confronted with a situation where you're challenged, whether it comes to operating protocols or whether it just comes to somebody's in your space that you and that's not the way that you want to operate right now. How do we deal with that? What are some of the key things that we approach this situation, especially when there are colleagues and friends? I might start with Bree on this one, if that's all right.
Sorry, thanks. It's bedtime too in my world. So I think the biggest piece of this is, and I always go back to this with things, is just knowing your truth of like, where do you stand on something, and being able to just tell people like, hey, this is where I'm at right now. This is why I'm doing this. If you need to, or I in this world right now, I need me to be safe. I have reasons for this. You can share those reasons, whether it's from a medical perspective or you're just, you really believe in the message of your company, or you have a family member that if they get COVID, they're certainly going to die, or they have cancer. So really it's just knowing your truth and sticking to that, and setting some boundaries with your friends, with your coworkers, and really, if we care about people, we generally just respect that. And I think that if you care about someone, you'll respect their boundaries, even if you may not totally agree with that.
Others want to weigh in? Merrick,
I think, another big part of that is safety and communication, right? So, each company developed their policies that they felt were going to keep them safe, or their guides safe, or lower risk. And so really trying to go back and adhere to, what did you as an organization and importantly, you as a crew, come together on to agree with, like, what's going to be safe, and really kind of sticking to that part of it. And then, as Bree mentioned, knowing your truth and then just communicating it, just like if we're all at a boat ramp together in a non-COVID time, we have to communicate, like, who's going to back down the trailer now and who's going to do that. So we still have to do that. COVID doesn't give us a reason to not communicate. And so just trying to be as thoughtful in that communication as possible, and understanding that, everybody might be at a different level where they are with this. Some people might be, less fearful than we are, and some people might be more fearful than we are, but trying to kind of put ourselves in their minds as to what might they be feeling, and being kind of empathetic to that situation as well.
I'm just going to weigh in with a slightly contrasting. I feel like you guys are like so kind and like really building that wonderful community within our like guiding realm, and like making sure that we support each other, and that like we're assuming that everybody else also has safety in mind. And I think that's a beautiful assumption, and like I hope that we can all stick with that. Like totally, like I think that's the ideal. I am, I think, a little more confrontational, especially after like seeing people die from COVID over and over again for the last few months. And so I think that I have a biased perspective, and I would be probably a little bit more aggressive of like, well, like, why is it that you're being selfish and not deciding to care about any other humans and not wearing a mask? And I don't think that there's a place for doing it untactfully, but I do think there's a place where like we have an opportunity to stand up for health and stand up for science. And just like guides are this amazing facilitators to be able to give people this experience that they wouldn't have otherwise, I think we also like can be facilitators of conversations around like community and like public health and public safety. You don't have to be an expert to be able to try to like talk about that kind of empathy. And so I think that like this conversation can be an opportunity, and I think that it, hopefully can open up to be like, in a more tactful way, like, let's all support each other and not be selfish by like not being safe.
Thanks, Jess. No, I very much appreciate the counterpoint. And I think one of the pillars of the Redside Foundation is that we lift up the guiding community as leaders, as leaders in all things, beyond just our interpretation of the wilderness and outdoor experiences for people, but also just being good humans with each other in outdoor spaces. And so I appreciate that counterpoint very much. So we have only about 6 minutes left in the webinar, and I just wanted to remind people listening to the webinar to weigh in with any questions that are burning, or any little experiences or things that you'd like us to talk about. Please put those in the Q&A. But without seeing those right this moment, I'll keep moving on with two things that I want to discuss briefly. One is the biggest thing we saw in our poll and that we knew about was that guide-guest relations have been strained. And one of the biggest things that we heard was we just didn't know what to do. And so guide crews kind of stayed away from guests more than normal. And there was a little bit more separation, and some of that interpretation of those intimate experiences are making people feel included. We're just by the wayside for safety. And so I'm wondering if, and I'll start with Merrick. Merrick, I wonder if you could weigh in on ways that that we can we can get beyond that, right? Without going up and hugging our guests, are there ways that we can foster a community of inclusion between guides and guests across in trips?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that, you know, we hear the term social distancing, right? And I think people confuse that with physical distancing. And so, you know, I kind of fall back to, you know, we can not be socially distant, but we can be physically distant, right? And so it is more challenging to create that connection. I mean, that's, you know, I mean, I think we'd all agree that one of the great things about a river trip is that connection between a guest and a guide. And it is harder, right? We fall into the trap of physical distancing. Well, maybe I'll feel less risky standing here in the kitchen and the guests will be over there or somewhere else, and it's safer here. And we have to respect that. At the same time, I think that, you know, by just trying to continue to focus on that connection, and maybe it has to be different. Maybe it's not just the hug at the end, but, you know, are there ways to point things out while we're on the river? Are there ways to, you know, do these other things? We have to continue to adapt and get more creative as guides. You know, how do we continue to create those connections? And maybe they're just different. Maybe it's a physically distanced reading that we're doing as opposed to all sitting together. You know, and so to me, I think that connection is still so important to try and figure out. But granted, it is tougher when you have a mask on, or it feels tougher when you have a mask on. It feels tougher when you're physically distanced, but continuing just to focus on, you know, what can I do to create that connection? I can still have a conversation with somebody if they're 6 feet away, but just maybe kind of rethinking that, how do I do that? And just continuing to try to create that connection rather than separating ourselves so physically that we can't.
Great, thanks. Bree, Jess, anything quickly?
Yeah, I think just in my world, that's like we've had to reinvent therapy with masks on or through telehealth. And so a lot of it is just being creative in your nonverbal language and being creative. And maybe you're connecting with one guest instead of several, or and just really trying to be really intentional with how you're communicating. And if it's like a big air high five or things like that, and it may be a little bit more silly, which for some of our more serious guides, even like myself, is a little hard. But yeah, I think it's just planning ahead and really just trying new things and being creative and finding what fits for you.
Can I add back in just a little bit too? You know, I mean, that connection, it's a big deal within ARDA. I mean, it's really kind of part of ARDA's culture. And, you know, one of the things that we do at the end of each season is we look at our trip evaluations and we look at how frequently guides are mentioned. And oftentimes guests mention guides by name and they tell that story of that connection. And we had some great stories this year of guides connecting with guests in different ways, whether it's, you know, on a hike picking berries or something that they did that really impacted that guest's life in a way that hadn't been done before. And so it's just a matter, I think, of all of us having to rethink how we do things in a way that's still super thoughtful, super connecting. But there are guides who are doing it. That's the great part. Like there's a lot of guides that did figure out how to do that this year in spite of COVID, in spite of masks, in spite of physical distancing.
Great. Thanks, Merrick. We got a really important question in the chat that I would be remiss if I didn't talk about. Can we speak a little bit more about guiding and ski huts? So winter guiding situations. Are there any ways that this can be managed? Is wearing a mask enough in your confined space for long periods of time? I think I'll probably start with Jess on this one. Go ahead.
This is perfect. I was just typing an answer for that. So I don't think that if you are confined in those small areas that wearing a mask is necessarily enough. If you're going to be with that same group, I think that what might make sense is to limit group sizes, which already is happening in those kind of winter trips where you have small groups, which I think is a good factor. Have people get tested beforehand if they're not already part of the same party. You know, if it's like a family that's already coming together and they already live together, then that's fine. They've already like created their little quarantine crew and they can come in. But getting tested beforehand, I think would be helpful, keeping in mind that the test is still only 70% sensitive. So there's still like a 30% false negative rate with the majority of our tests that we're having now. But I think that could be helpful. other thing is that I wonder on these hut trips if you could have a separate sleeping versus like eating quarters. So if you could sleep with a smaller group than you ate with, I think that could be another possibility as well. And that like that eating, you can, you know, sort of stay distant, but still be in that same group. And then you have your own personal space to go to. I think it would depend on like your hut setup. I do think though that just wearing masks, like we'll have to have kind of other precautions. We talked about this a little bit in our preparation. And I think the big thing would be like planning ahead and then having good post-trip communication. So if somebody were to end up becoming symptomatic right after the trip, making sure that we had a really good policy in place to then communicate that. I think people were already doing that this summer, but I think it becomes even more important when you're in these like really tight-knit groups that like even asymptomatic spread, which does happen, is less likely because you have a lower viral load if you're asymptomatic, but you can still spread it. I think that just becomes even more important in that setting.
Thanks, Jess. I really appreciate that. I think we'll transition to our last point, and then we'll end on time. Well, maybe a little bit over. I want to thank all the panelists again for being here and providing your expertise. I think that one of the take-home messages for at least the spring, summer, fall season so far, 2020, is that guiding, outfitting, and being in the outdoors is alive and well. And we were able to make this happen. People wanted to come outside and to be outside with us, and we were able to do it safely. There were challenges. There were many challenges, but they were navigated, and so it wasn't perfect, but a lot of the protocols that were put in place worked well. If you have more questions about protocols, there's a lot of great resources out there. Idaho Outfitting and Guiding Association, IOGA, put together quite a bit of resources in conjunction with Redside's resources that we put out. So check our website, check their website. Also, just get in touch with us personally. Shannon, did you want to say something? Go ahead.
Yeah, get in touch personally. You can always email me at info@ or director@ or shannon@redsidefoundation.org. If I don't know the answer, I'll point you in the right direction, but we are a great resource for that.
And there's a lot of other organizations across the country that have done similar webinars and put similar information kind of on their website. So there's a lot out there. And so I'd have you investigate that, because COVID, as Jess said right at the beginning, will be around in 2021, and we'll be dealing with it again as we move through the winter season and back into the spring. But so take home message, guiding and outfitting is alive and well. And the last thing I'll say is that transitions this year for guides, whether it's into a fall winter season or out of a summer season, transitions may be harder because we're all fatigued. We're fatigued from dealing with a global pandemic and the changes to our lives that's happened. Because that's happened, we're fatigued from burnout of working so much. It seems like everything's ramping up and becoming much harder in these times. Have election fatigue. We have a lot of different fatigues kind of coming at us right now. And so I think our take-home message for the guide crew out there is to be very intentional about your support networks this winter. Be very intentional about your safety. Reach out to people and say, I want you to be my quarantine crew. I want you to be the people that we protect each other, but we get together. We do things outside. We go hiking. We go backcountry skiing. We hang out. So just do what, as Bree mentioned earlier, self-care. Even though it's a bit of a buzzword, it's an important buzzword that has some big things behind it. Bree, Merrick, Jess, final thoughts?
Have courage, be kind.
Get ready for next year.
Bree?
Be well, stay safe.
All right. Well, thanks once again to our panelists. On behalf of the Redside Foundation, we really appreciate all of you joining us. We will make this video available online so you can watch it, share it with your friends, share it with your guide crews, share it with your outfitters. Like us on Facebook, like us on Instagram, follow us on Twitter, and tell us what we can do to help keep your adventures safe and to provide you with the information you need to be safe in the outside. So thanks so much and have a great evening. Talk soon.
Thanks.